Welcome back to another edition. And tonight we're going to be discussing Jean Baudrillard and his concept of simulation. So we have been working on some themes in postmodernism for the past few episodes. Going back 2 or 3 episodes, we were discussing Foucault and postmodernism in the episode on truth and power. In the last episode, we discussed a little bit about the avant-garde and a little bit about my own personal views on the postmodern movement, and how it might be thought about in terms of the production of art and what goes into the production of art. And tonight we're going to take another step in the same direction and consider another theory about how to think about what postmodernism is, and also how it relates to the modern scene. You can bring that out of Baudrillard through looking at his concepts of the copy, the series, and then finally the simulacrum. And the copy being an early stage of production, and you can think about the classic artistic production where you are just trying to create a work that represents something in a faithful manner. There's an artist named Malevich who wrote an essay called Suprematism. And in the essay, he discusses the reaction of the public to an art piece that he did, which was just a black cube on a white background. And the way the public reacted to it was they thought that this represented one more step toward the death of art, the end of art. Because the kind of art that people wanted was representational art. The public was expecting some sort of technical mastery in the representation of the world. And what Malevich was trying to accomplish was the projection of a feeling that went beyond representation. So that's an instance of a change in the way things, in the way that people thought about art at the beginning of the 20th century. So that's a representational way of production, a representational mode of production, which has been with us since ancient times. And as you proceed a little bit further into the 20th century, you get into the series, the mass-produced, commodified item, which could be a piece of art, could be a painting, sculpture, could be a piece of music. And all those things eventually were reproduced. A painting eventually becomes a poster on somebody's wall in a college dorm room. A symphony that took months of training and practice for a symphony orchestra to create and put together to perfection on one particular evening becomes a recording that can be heard over and over and over again, and so on and so forth. So that's the series. And then the third stage of development is the simulacrum. And this is really the heart of Baudrillard's theory about where we are currently. This is a stage that takes off in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. And what the procession of simulacra are is a series of reproduced items that don't necessarily have any reference to anything. They don't necessarily refer back to some stable reality that we can encounter in the world, But what they do is they have a kind of self-referentiality, or they'll refer to other members of the same series. And I have a quote from Baudrillard that helps to bring the concept together. So he says, "The very definition of the real has become that of which it is possible to give an equivalent reproduction. The real is not only what can be reproduced, but that which is always already reproduced. The hyperreal, which is entirely in simulation." So, an example that he gives, which is kind of famous, is the Gulf War. And he was asked if he would like to go and report on the Gulf War in Iraq. And he famously refused, saying, "There's really no reason for me to do that. If I go to Iraq and try to report on the war, I'm only just going to get fragments of the war. But what I should really do to experience the war is to just sit in my apartment in front of the television, because then I will experience the war as it is really being felt by people as a war, as, in a sense, a simulation of the war, because that is the reality of the war that we really experience. The full simulated reality of the war as it appears on the television, not as it has been experienced in tiny fragments and discontinuous episodes by individuals who are involved in the war, but there's a sense in which the simulation of the war competes with the actual reality of the war itself, so that there's a sense in which that really is the war, and then again it's not the war. And it's that way in which media begins to simulate reality that begins to compete with the reality itself. On the one hand, it is the truth of the situation, that is the war as we've experienced it. On the other hand, it's not. And it's this mixing of the true and the false together that corresponds to the idea of the simulation. The simulation has to be adequate enough as a version of reality that it hides the fact that it is a simulation. So there's a way in which the simulation, as a successful simulation, hides or conceals the fact that it is a simulation. And Baudrillard writes a lot about the concept of seduction, and perhaps you could relate the concept of seduction to simulation. There's a sense in which someone who is trying to seduce someone is putting up a front, is putting up a certain set of appearances to lead you into a certain space, to lead you into a certain frame of mind, and thereby to help you take on a certain kind of mental perspective, a kind of view from within that space of seduction. And that is what a successful simulation does as well. It takes you in, it draws you into its set of appearances, and if it's successful, the difference between the real and the simulated may not even cross your mind. It leads you into this space where you accept the simulation of reality as reality, even if there's some part of your mind, somewhere in your mind, you're thinking, well, this isn't quite real. We end up accepting it as a kind of narrative that makes sense to us, and it's in a sense kind of a pill that we can swallow simply because it allows us to make sense of the world. So within this idea of simulation, I think one way that you can try to handle the concept is maybe to think about types of simulation along a certain spectrum. So there's a simulation that looks like it's trying to be faithful to reality on one end of the spectrum. There's another kind of simulation on the other end of the spectrum that is leading you more into a space where you have a system of signs that's leading you into a conceptual realm, and it's not so much about the visual aspect as it is the conceptual aspect of the thing. So in that case, you could say that with the concept of fake news, there is an attempt to try to lead you into a certain version of reality and accept that version as a narrative that you can buy into, as a kind of simulation of real events competing with other narratives. Now, I think that probably the best way to bring together the entire set of concepts that Baudrillard discusses in relation to the simulation idea would be to go all the way back to the Saussurean conception of language as a system of signs. And this seems to be the core principle behind the way that Baudrillard discusses simulation. At a certain point, the items that we produce don't merely try to reflect reality, but they either become part of a system of signs, and they do so self-consciously, or they represent a system of signs themselves, like the Iraq War. So let me give you an example of a representation that gives you a partial system of signs that you can relate to another system of signs. So it would be something like advertising for Marlboro cigarettes. So you see some cowboys, and they could be real cowboys, they could be fake cowboys, whatever. But what's going on here in terms of simulation is that they're simulating a lifestyle, they're simulating a form of behavior. And within that simulated lifestyle, you have the cigarettes being associated with certain ideas that really are there subliminally in a certain sense. They're there to help your mind draw an association between the things that you see and the cigarettes. So if you think of the Marlboro cowboy as living this free lifestyle, or if you associate the image you see there with the tough individualist, you see an association there with somebody who is strong or determined, or any of the sorts of things that you might like to be at some point in your life. If you feel like those qualities are lacking in you, at some moment, when you feel like you might want to feel a little more assured of yourself, or something like that, the way that those cowboys look in those images, like, you don't have to consciously think these thoughts for them to come up out of your subconscious, from out of your unconscious. They come up out of there because of the way in which your mind has drawn together these different associations. And there's a sense in which you are simulating yourself, the reality that you saw. So there's a sense in which you are simulating something that was simulated. I shouldn't say the reality you saw, but I should say the simulation that you saw in the advertisement. So you can think of advertising as a series of simulations. You can think of advertising in the sense of here's a system of signs that interlocks with a larger system of signs. Another idea that you can bring in to understand this whole concept might be something like trying to understand what it would be like to try to be a peasant in the year 2021. And the thing that might be difficult is just understanding what it would mean to be an authentic peasant in the year 2021. Because we have been so bombarded with images, we have become so saturated with all of these different images and concepts of what peasants look like that we can't be sure that when we go out to try to be peasants and we put on our woolen garments and we wear our wooden shoes and start acting like peasants, whether we're not just simulating the behavior of peasants. How do we, as people who live in the 21st century, how do we find our way to the real? Not by going through a simulation, but just by being. There's a sense in which trying to be something always leads you to a preliminary stage of taking on a certain behavior, trying to conform to a certain model. So, for a peasant in the 11th century, you don't have this problem. The only images of peasants that you've ever seen might be in a cathedral somewhere where they're carved into stone. There are very few images in this society. And in that world, you're not going to think about the image of a peasant and then try to simulate, a peasant lifestyle based upon these images. It's going to be much easier, in a sense, to reproduce the life of a peasant just by looking at other peasants. But in our technologically advanced society, where so much around us mimics and involves itself in systems of signs that all point to the way in which a world can be built up out of them, to try to be a peasant is to try to enter into a system of signs and enter into a simulated world. One other remark that I'll make about this whole thing, which it's my idea. I think it's kind of interesting. I, I think it's kind of interesting to try to apply this to social media and to ask to what extent people are merely simulating certain forms of behavior when they're on social media. So, one thing that you could consider is whether group identification on social media is taking on a sense of simulation. And I mean it in this sense. So people get online, they go on Facebook, they start affiliating themselves with a group. And in one way, you could start to wonder about the depth of their commitment to that. You could wonder about the depth of their commitment from the standpoint of, does this translate into their voting habits? Do they go out and actively participate in these things outside of social media? Or is what it's really about just mimicking certain behaviors that are allowing them to identify with a particular group? And so what we end up with is a kind of virtual politics, a politics that exists in a realm of electronic social media that kind of operates, to use Baudrillard's own image, as kind of like a satellite, this simulated reality that orbits around our real Earth reality in a certain sense. Now, one other thing I'll bring in here is just a little bit of contrast with Foucault. So, Foucault did a lot of archaeological work in trying to lead us up to the point where we could see that surveillance was going to be a form of power that began to become more and more a part of our daily society. And as a lot of people would seem to agree, that prediction has borne itself out. There's a certain sense in which power gains leverage over things like not just being able to watch someone in a literal sense, and maybe even just by being able to threaten someone with being watched, but with things like being able to give someone an examination as a sense of overseeing them that has a very, very strong influence on their behavior, forces them into a certain mode of conformity and discipline. Another thing that he brings in would be oversight on a factory floor or oversight in all sorts of different ways in an office environment that influence people's behavior, cause them to conform to certain standard modes of behavior. And with Baudrillard, where he's going beyond that and leading us more to something that looks like our present day situation, we have things like the media, as I was pointing out with advertising. There's a certain way in which using signs, using symbols, and their power to suggest ways in which we can make ourselves, present ourselves, and ways in which we can enter into a simulated version of reality becomes a form of power. And the interesting thing is that when we decide to enter into that system of signs that defines that simulated reality out there, when we change our behavior to try to fit in with that environment, with that virtual environment, with the social media environment, when we remake ourselves in that way, it's as if we're empowering ourselves, but at the same time, because we're fitting into this system of signs, we are also causing ourselves to conform to that world of virtual reality, which is enabling other people to profit from it through the amount of clicks that we're able to bring in, through the amount of information that is being generated online, and ultimately even these activities become politically useful. They become useful for politicians, not only because it's available as information, but because when you have people participating in these environments, and some of them are influential, significant in swaying people's opinions, all of a sudden things can be moved in a political direction. So top influencers, you might think, well, those are, some of the most popular people on YouTube. But don't forget that there's an awful lot of media on social media. As you scroll through Facebook, at least on my Facebook, I see a lot of different advertisements. And interspersed with people's posts, you see different bits of news. A lot of people will repost news items that they've seen. And as a lot of people have noticed, there's a way in which the way people talk and think in your circle has a big influence on other people's behavior within that circle. And if we, as people who are trying to get power for ourselves, or we're just trying to belong somewhere within that space, modify our behavior to try to fit into that simulated reality, we're taking a certain amount of power for ourselves, but we're also giving up a certain amount of power. We're empowering the people who want to use that space for their own purposes. And it is shaping people's behavior. It's giving people an incentive to act in certain ways that they wouldn't act in their daily lives, say things and do things and react in certain ways that they wouldn't react in a normal conversation, discussion out on the street, which, even in this reality of, high political tensions and whatnot, personally, I've found it more possible, much more possible, to have discussions with people offline in in real in the real world, in the real space, than anywhere online I've ever, been able to interact with people. Those are a few ideas about simulation that come from Jean Baudrillard. I think you can still apply those ideas to art in the sense that, and this is just my own personal idea here, in the sense that the simulated seems to have a dimension to it of mobility. So the closer we get to the idea of the pure simulation, there's something about it that has a certain way of moving through time. So that might be that the simulation causes you to act and react and continue to move forward within a certain simulated space. Or it might be that you take the image of the cowboy and then later reproduce it in time in your own behavior, as somebody who suddenly has an urge to have a cigarette. But there is this dimension that as you move toward the purer form of simulation, there's something more mobile about it. There's something more alive, more active. And maybe the purest form of simulation of all would be something like virtual reality, where that time dimension is an essential part of the simulation itself. Or something like an android, which is a simulacrum of a human. So those are just a few thoughts about that. And it's certainly been a powerful, influential concept, and it's a way to try to distinguish the postmodern world from the world of modernity just by distinguishing it from a world of representations, and now moving into the idea of a system of signs that's mobile, that moves through time, that has a kind of life of its own in a certain sense, that mimics reality, and in which it is difficult to determine the true from the false. And those are a few hallmarks of the postmodern era. So, with that, I'll say goodnight.